Thank you very much for joining us, either in person or online. What I'm sure is going to be an engaging and enlightening conversation. My name is Paulo Gomez. I'm faculty in the Departments of Medical History and Bioethics and the Department of History here at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm going to be moderating our roundtable tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the homelands of the Ho-Chunk people whose ancestors lived in this region for at least 12,000 years, but who were forcibly removed by our state and federal governments following the Treaty of 1832. This roundtable is part of the Interrogating the Plantationocene Sawyer Seminar, which is an ongoing project aiming to come to terms with the plantation, the transformational moment in human and natural history on a global scale. In thinking with the Plantationocene, we aim to be attentive to structures of power embedded in imperial and capitalist formations, the erasure of certain forms of life and relationships, and the enduring layers of history, legacies of plantation capitalism that persist, manifested in acts of racialized violence, growing land alienation, and accelerated species loss. At the same time, the project also aims to make visible past and present refugia of resistance where different ways of being sustained by different economies and forms of knowledge have flourished. Can you hear me well in the back, by the way? Is this fine? I hear some sort of echo here. So I also want to acknowledge that all events in the seminar are made possible by generous funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and its John E. Sawyer Seminar Program, and by support from the Center for the Humanities, the Holt Center for Science and Technology Studies, and the Nelson Institute Center for Culture, History, and Environment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I hope many of you were able to attend the first roundtable that we had a couple of weeks ago. I want to remind you that on Thursday, April 18th at 7:30, we'll be gathering again to talk about the idea of the Plantationocene with Professor Donna Haraway and Anna Singh. So please mark your calendars and notice that this event will take place not in this room, but across the street at the Union South on Dayton Street, okay? And tonight, we will be discussing the idea of the Capitalocene and the implications of thinking about the emergence of capitalism with its attendant demands for cheap labor, energy, food, and resources as fundamental shaper of our times and planetary crisis. So after a very short introduction, so we have time for more time for conversations, the panelists and I will be discussing a series of questions for about 40 minutes, and then I will open the floor for questions from the audience. We will be ending at around 9 p.m. And I encourage those of you who are joining us via our live stream to submit your questions via the chat box, and we will be reading them here. We will try to fill as many as we can. So without further ado, our three distinguished panelists tonight are Shona Jackson, who is Associate Professor of English at Texas A&M University, Michelle Murphy, who is Professor of History and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto, and Jason Moore, who is Professor of Sociology at Binghamton University. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It is really a privilege having all of you here. And I want to start by asking you to talk a little bit about what are the benefits or drawbacks of this idea of the Capitalocene, and specifically, how do you think is different from the notion of the Anthropocene, something that we have been hearing a lot about and which we discussed a couple of weeks ago. So there is no specific order. So
should I take it
please
briefly?
Yeah.
So we have today a very popular discourse around the Anthropocene, which purports not only to explain the development of crisis, of the reality of planetary crisis, but also its historical origins. And so there are really two competing Anthropocenes. One is a geological Anthropocene, which is associated with stratigraphic signals, of which three appear to be decisive: the residues from atomic testing, chicken bones, and plastics. These are all that will be left of modernity millions of years from now. So make of that what you will. There's another Anthropocene, which is the popular Anthropocene, which goes back to an old environmentalist trope and an old Malthusian trope, and indeed an imperial trope, which is man and nature. Anthropocene, age of humans, humans versus nature. That's deeply problematic for a whole series of reasons. One is that the discourse and actual practice historically from Columbus all the way to the present of civilization or humanity and nature has been a practical guide to domination and to devastation of landscapes, but also the human beings who are embedded in them. It is also poor history because it teaches us that the root of planetary crisis is something called the Industrial Revolution, which supposedly has to do with coal and steam power is the whole story. And so the Capitalocene counter-argument says that the origins are much earlier. They are in the centuries following the invasion of the Americas and the kind of fusion, the ecology of power and domination, of capital accumulation, and the ways of thinking and knowing and representing the world that took shape between the Columbian invasion and the great biogeographical unification of Pangaea in a modern sense that followed. It looks at that moment in the centuries that followed as absolutely pivotal to making the whole world, not just nature in the way we think about it, but the whole world into a series of profit-making machines or profit-making opportunities. So the Capitalocene does not say it's all about economics, and it does not say this is a substitute for the geological argument. It says that we are looking at a system of power, of production and reproduction, of capital accumulation that is always in and within the web of life. So that's a starting point.
Very good.
Okay, maybe I'll start with what I think about the Anthropocene and then go to the Capitalocene. So I appreciated Jason's description of the Anthropocene, and particularly we can think of the Anthropocene as concerned with finding these signals, whether it be concentrations of microplastics, whether it be radioisotopes, whether it be things like the number of McDonald's around the world, like looking for these signals that have to exist at a planetary level. And so part of the conceit of the Anthropocene is trying to define a planetarily scaled problem and claim not just a planetarily scaled problem, but a singular time frame that contains the whole planet that began a long time ago. So what don't I like about this? I don't like the problem of the planetary scaled problem. A planetary scaled problem invites theories of change that are about planetary solutions. Planetary solutions look a lot like geoengineering. They look a lot like imperial governance. They look like military projects and military optics around the world. That planetary sensibility was only formed out of imperialism. It was formed a lot out of American militarism and its satellites and measures of planetary change. It was formed out of the American nuclear complex. So I'm not interested in a planetarily scaled problem that comes out of that history. I think that it offers also no significant explanation about the relations of power and profound unevenness of violence that make up our world. Instead, in looking for planetary signals that are universalized, it erases the profound unevenness of violence in the world. So those are some of the reasons I don't like the Anthropocene, even as like it's a useful foil. What I like about the Capitalocene is that, okay, now let's get some things on the table. Let's talk about the specificities of colonialism. Let's talk about the doctrine of discovery. Let's talk about the rise of treating land as resource in a capitalist frame. So all of that is really great. What I don't like about the Capitalocene is the scene part. The sense that, again, wanting to name a universal world timescape. There is an imperial, to my thinking, an imperial gaze that it's asking us to participate in that is not something I would want to reproduce. I think it's very important to understand not just that environmental violence is uneven, but there are many ways of worlding our world. And these many ways of worlding our world have different forms of time, have different timescapes, have different histories. And that in many ways, I believe that those other worlds that are here are where the possibility of making less violent worlds might come from. And so if that's the case, then I don't want an explanation that is constituting a universal, that isn't amplifying and supporting and giving resurgence to the other worlds that are already here, that persist, that aren't part of constituting a world of massive transnational environmental violence. So these are some of the reasons I don't like the Capitalocene, but also like what it puts on the table, or appreciate what it puts on the table against the Anthropocene.
Well, briefly, so I've spent, I guess, the last week or so reading work, and I don't necessarily think of them in terms of an opposition, right? I think each is about a different kind of narcissism that we're all sort of guilty of. One is the narcissism of man, the Anthropocene, and the other is the narcissism of man. And I don't necessarily just mean that to dismiss them. And if that weren't the case, then I don't know that we would have all of these other scenes that are trying to compete with the term. Have the Tulacene, I'm trying to say Tulacene rather than Cthulhu. The Tulacene, and that's Haraway, and the Necrocene, and
Brian.
yes, and then the Plantation-Ocene. I think each of them does a certain kind of work, but again, I worry about the way in which they try to describe things holistically on a model that is actually rather than one that sort of disaggregates things and allows for other possibilities. So I guess that is my basic concern.
I think there's a slippage. There's a slippage here, though. Michelle, you know I'm a huge fan of your thinking and your analysis between the universal and the world historical. And it's very crucial to understand that we want to be critical of the universalisms of modernity, above all, but not only the binaries of man and nature, around gender, around sexuality, around race, et cetera, et cetera. We want to be very aware of those as lived abstractions, as abstractions that are instruments of power. At the same time, there's a world historical issue of understanding that capitalism's world historicity is that of a real place that is neither more nor less than than the contributions of other places. And so we all live this on an everyday basis, right? The clothes we wear, the computers we use, the food we eat, these are all world historical acts in which we are linked to the biosphere in intimate and ways every day. That is the world historical accomplishment of capitalism, one of its sites of horror and all the rest. So I think it's really important that we come to grips with the world historical imagination as a way of grasping capitalism, not as a master key, not as a God trick, as a way of exposing capital's God trick, or God tricks. And so I think there's a tension there, and world historians haven't done themselves any favors because they've been in love with universalisms and master keys. So I'm with you there.
Mm-hmm. And obviously many of the ways in which the whole apparatus that we use to think about these issues actually are emerging right out of that universalizing kind of tendency. So obviously there is also tension, even in the ways in which we in academia tend to refer and think about those issues. So I want to push you a little bit. I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about these problems that you are bringing to the surface here. So what are the problems of naming and thinking about our world, our epoch, from frameworks that are revolving around these political, economical, or scientific frameworks? What kind of histories, genealogies are kind of left behind? I just want you to flesh out a little bit of, and I know all of you deal with this in your work, so, but I think it will be very useful for all of us to hear you talking more a little bit about what we're discussing here. What is pushed outside in those localities, in those slippages, in those analyses that follow seemingly, inescapable teleological economic trajectory. So.
The question is what's left out in the naming. Oh gosh, I think you that. I mean, always named things. All of the epochs that exist, we name. But that, I think, when that we is part of the problem, it's who's been able to do that naming, and we don't have other ways of thinking about or talking about or referencing the Pleistocene or the Holocene. We don't have other terms. We don't have other narratives that come from that come necessarily from non-Western peoples, etc. I think those other ways of knowing are left out. And I don't know that the terms that we have can, not so much that they can't out to them, but I don't think they can represent them. So that, yeah.
So what gets left out of when we do the Capitalocene? Or think at that kind of...
Or think even more largely, not only the Capitalocene.
Not necessarily the Capitalocene, but think about like a world.
Traditional ways that we have to think about our world.
Yeah. So, I'm really, really reticent to make world-scaled arguments of causality. And partly it's because exactly the thing that Jason named, which is it's really hard to not reproduce the imaginary of the full sublime of capitalist like the capitalist world, that capitalism dreams for us, that it is fully surrounding us, that it explains the world, that it is in everything we do, that it's here all the time. And on the one hand, I don't deny, of course, I would be crazy to deny the world historical force of capitalism in its materiality and its connectivity and its destructivity and so on. But I really believe that there are other timescapes that are here that are where I want to start with. And part of the reason I would think I want to start with these other timescapes is because I'm interested also in not just to accounting for world breaking, but world making and world persisting. And the timescapes and the scalings for projects of world persisting. And when I say world, I don't mean the globe. I mean the way of living and being and understanding and interacting and understanding what populates the world. That's scaled in a much more intimate level than the planet. And so if that's the case, my kind of political practice or my kind of theory of change is that I need to be attending to the worlds and the times at that scale. And the worlds and the times at that scale are not that of global capital. So for example, like just, thinking about my own work and my own self. So I'm Métis, I'm from Winnipeg. I live in Toronto, which is Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee territory. I do work about Chemical Valley, which is Anishinaabe territory. And the question of that land, the question of the longevity of that land, the understanding of where people come from as coming from land. So people don't come like, I give birth to my child and my child gives birth to the child. And that's just, it's people come from the land and go to the land, right? The land rises life. And so when we understand land in that way, when we think about land and our genealogies in land going far, far back for thousands of years, when we think then also about our responsibilities of land being to those are yet to come, our future relatives are in that land, right? That's a different timescape. It's a different worlding. It's a different understanding of who's a people, what's alive, where persistence is. All this is what I mean when I say other worlds are here, other worldings are happening. And so that's where I feel like the project of persistence and the project of world making happens. And so I'm much more inclined to those temporalities in a way, or those ways of thinking of histories, because they give that theory of change. They give that theory of persistence, where for me at least, while I learned so much from the world historical and the transnational relations of multinational capital and the formation of the nation state, and they're all around the world, and all these things that have also so powerfully made a world that can be destroyed and not be called destruction, that all that's gone into that. I must attend to that. I must study that. I must know that. But it also does not explain me. And it does not explain where I think me and my kin and our community is going to persist from. And so maybe that's like a way of thinking about like a different kind of project, maybe. That's like one is understanding how world breaking works, and another is maybe thinking about how world making works. I don't know.
But, yeah.
But I wanted to add part of the, I mean, I love explanatory tools, and so I don't want to necessarily, set any of these things aside. I think, again, they all do a different kind of work. But the thing that troubles me is it's precisely that sort of different worlds and then world making, or different concepts of world, are left out. And one of the things that keeps coming up in the literature that I read is that, for instance, Indigenous peoples and Blacks are constantly referred to in terms of these, I guess, time signatures, genocide and enslavement. And their sort of presence in the narrative isn't there. And so I don't understand that. And then I also wonder that everything we do has to get swept up into one particular narrative. So there's a piece that I have coming out. It's a response to the ASA presidential address this year. It's a really, really short piece. And part of it came out of when I was in Guyana this year. My mom hadn't been in a really long time, and so she's kind of reliving the landscape and the way that it changed. And, our family was really hideously poor. Talks about this one day when she was a kid, she and her cousins, they had nothing to do. They were hungry, they're crumbling, and they went out and they started cutting the grass, right? They just started cutting the grass, and then they put $1 in the grass. And they went out, and she remembers exactly what that $1 went. And this is could purchase, and this was before independence. So it purchased enough to feed about 8 people. And I always think $1. So I don't know what they actually ate the $1. Right? It was never not a part of them. And I think we have to find a way to actually begin to think that. And I think the Capitalocene sort of is pushing us in that way by trying to collapse the nature society divide and other sorts of things. But the second thing is they were doing this action, this bodily action that didn't go anywhere. They were cutting grass. They were hungry. They were just cutting grass that didn't even need to be cut. So I want to try to leave space for all of these other bodily actions that don't necessarily accumulate or go anywhere. And so how do we think them? Are those, are they the sort of signal points of different worlds, of different, or other trajectories and histories that don't necessarily fit into the framework of a capitalist world ecology? So
I want to be careful that I don't stand in for the totalizing, formalist, systemic determinist version of saying capitalism exists.
Yeah.
And I feel, here's what I think. 1,000 times I endorse everything that you just said and everything that you just said. Of course, we have multiple timescales that are in fact constitutive of capitalism. I would say that those are in themselves constitutive of the civilization that is indeed, alas, unfortunately, planetary. And yet it is not the total. I feel like this is a tricky thing for us to move beyond. We need to move beyond the systemic determinism and then the particularism of lived experience. How do we do that? How do we have discussions that fundamentally transcend those? A colleague of mine a long time ago said, Jason, I think what you're doing, she was trying to put me in this kind of world systems mind, and that didn't work. She was trying to put me in this other mind. She said, I think what you're trying to write is an ethnography of how capitalism works, which means that we write situated stories of capitalism. Many of us do it at different time scales and different geographical scales. There is an important task of the radical to unearth the imminent tendencies of capitalism, which are world historical, which are totalizing. And so it becomes difficult. How do we reveal a world that is messy, is contentious, is full of human experiences that are far from subsumed by some iron logic of capital accumulation? And for me, the Capitalocene was, to borrow a phrase from Donna Haraway, sympoiesis. It is a sympoetic. How do we narrate the emergence? How do we tell stories about the emergence of capitalism as a world ecology in which the webs of life matter, including human webs of life, in which the audacious cultural construct of civilization and nature that puts most human beings on this planet into the realm of nature and treats them cheaply as a result of both the sense of price, but also in the sense of ethico-political devaluation. How do we identify those? How do we put those into play at the same time without flattening out the rich experience of the Métis in the middle ground, or any of a number of innumerable experiences? How do we put those together? And I see that is really, at least for me, the possibility of counterposing the geopoetic Capitalocene to Anthropocene, because Anthropocene is the way of thinking of the conqueror. There's no other way to put that. So how do we open that up? And then if we, Capitalocene is ugly. I say an ugly word for an ugly system. We can move to something different. So I agree about the scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, because partially, I mean, what you're trying, well, what you're inviting us to get at is also the recognition that the seemingly overarching system is really part of a larger world that is sustaining it, right? And it is deployed in a specific way, in a specific part. So, so I thought I would like to ask you to talk about that world that actually sustains that what seemingly functions, right, as something that is kind of self-sufficient, that reproduces the narratives that actually keeps it moving, both capitalism as a way of, as a political economic system, but this is something larger, right? This is something larger that also produces historicity, that also produces certain kinds of ideas about how the world functions and what the stories that we tell. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about that world that is, and both of you start talking a little bit about the world that sustains capitalism, the kind of work that is not recognizing those political economic frameworks that we talk about labor, for instance, uniquely, right? Because there is obviously something, a web of beings that actually is what makes possible for capitalism to emerge.
I don't know, I feel like that's so hard. Can you ask a simpler question?
This is the question: how has capitalism reproduced itself?
Yep.
By continually going to frontiers? Now, there is an imperialist and racist way of doing that, and we've seen a lot of that over the past, telling those stories. That is, we've seen a lot of that around over the past 100+ years. We've seen a revolt and a counter movement to that. I think for me, my discovery as I was trying to come to grips with the origins of planetary crisis and capitalism's drive towards that was to discover just how utterly weak the powers of capital are when it cannot move to what in capital's eyes, not in our eyes, in capital's eyes are frontiers of cheap labor, food, land, energy, raw materials, lives, care, go down the list. And so capital this was a way of coming to grips with how capitalism is a tremendously costly and inefficient system that drives planetary crisis, because in order to survive, it has to continually rely on the unpaid work, in Maria Mies's great turn of phrase, of women, nature, and colonies. And so that brings squarely into the center questions of power and domination, but also resistance to it, but also doesn't ignore, and I think this is your earlier question about political economic formulations. Now we want to be careful that we don't invert the problem, because there is a dynamic of capital accumulation historically and in the present that is tremendously significant to our politics. So we want to be aware of that, and we want to also avoid bagging on people like Rosa Luxemburg, who I think is the greatest Marxist theorist of the 20th century. You say, oh, she was a breakdown theorist. Well, she was also a socialist militant who was killed for her troubles. So all of these people writing the sort of political economy were also militants, by and large. And so it's important to connect that and to understand that Marxism especially has long been at the forefront, at the front lines of the fight against fascism and empire and the very problems of domination. So we need to find ways to put these together.
I keep thinking about, like, part of what you're asking is a question of reproductive justice. So what are the
ways it is?
Yeah, which is like what gets allowed to persist and what is not allowed a future. And that this can be epistemological, it can be infrastructural, it can be at the level of, I would say, even like feeling and dreaming. And so I feel like very much embattled with the reproductive force of capital. And part of what I want to do is deny it my imaginary. So I want to, of course, address it in its material form, but I also want to deny it in my imaginary in terms of, you know, these questions of how do we understand futures? How do we understand futures in our pasts? Where do we see life? Where do we find support, and so on? So I have so because that's my like inclination, I get like I can feel myself reacting, right, to like too big descriptions, right, or descriptions that are really big about the kind of capitalism as the primary, you know, it's not everything, but the key force of reproduction on our planet. I just feel like I don't want to grant capital that kind of sublime. And I know then you feel like maybe I'm making you a determinist and all that kind of thing, but I don't even think it's you. I think it's capital. Like that, in the sense that we keep getting gifted this version, right, of like that version of capital. And so, yeah, so I struggle with that because I don't want to be giving that story, even if it doesn't mean that I'm not doing analyses of how corporations work, how capitalism dispossesses, how nature is made cheap, how land is destroyed, all the destructions that capital doesn't count as destruction, all of that has to be in the analysis. Sorry.
Capital.
That's my reproductive. That's my kid. So, but then thinking about reproductive justice, like, and like reproductive justice really is inclined to put so much more on the table. To think about reproduction is not just like what happens in our bodies, and it's not just what happens in capital, but it's like what are our conditions for existing. And once we start thinking about like what we want to be reproducing together, then quickly my eye turns away from capital, right? Because what I want to be reproducing together is forms of being, forms of kinship, forms of land, my mind, and therefore my theory of change goes
But that's the negation
elsewhere.
of capital.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's not, but it's not just the negation of capital. I don't think all world makings that are not capital are merely its negation. But yes.
But I don't think we're disagreeing.
No, I'm not saying we're necessarily disagreeing. I'm just like sharing, like noticing different ways of putting things and like my reactions to different framings.
Struggle with how, when you articulate a position, it, well, particularly again with other, right? So whenever you propose something, it becomes caught up in a kind of agonism, some kind of dialectic. We're unable to sort of get beyond understanding that a particular thing isn't else. How do you claim and recognize something else? So that's one thing. And so I share Michelle's sort of desire to think in different ways. But I get stuck. Because I don't know how to do that. And so recently in Houston, I guess in the Deer Park area, there was the fire on March 17th. And my family and I, we go to Houston all the time. We were there a few days before the fire. And the plant that sort of, the chemical plant, the tanks that caught fire, one of the things that they had in the tanks is the stuff that they used to make nail polish remover. And I'm wearing nail polish. And so you were gesturing to that before. So we can think about reproduction, we can think about reproductive justice, but I'm really caught by the things that we have and what we are constantly reproducing by those things. So how do we find like another space? How do we think differently? And then also simultaneously account for our complicity? That's the thing that I'm struggling with. There has to be an account of that.
You know what, this just totally makes me think about Fanon. Big surprise. I'm always bringing up Fanon. And thinking about, well, we could go to different parts of Fanon, but thinking about particularly, black skin, white mask, and thinking about his posing of, a negative dialectic, like the thing you must critique, but that's not enough. And then the thing you are forced to claim, but the thing you're forced to claim is messed up too. And so then you're between the claim, the impossible claim and the impossible critique. And then where do you end up? You end up on the one hand, weeping, but you also end up with claims like, I am my own foundation. That, right? Which is kind of where you started, Shona, which is that, there's the critique, right? The critique of capital. There's the needing to claim something else, right? The something else that's also constituting me and also constituting my history and so on. There's the weeping at the unresolvability of it, of the unescapability of it, the violence of it, right? The impossibility of it. But then there's also the position, the insistence, which is, I am my own foundation. I will not be the other to something else. And so just our conversation really just reminded me of that laying out of a kind of problem of the decolonial project.
One thing that almost always we lose sight of this, is that there is a world history to the origins and development of planetary crisis, of the end of the Holocene that we're living through today. There is an actually existing history. There are actually existing historical patterns that are not just theoretically imposed. Cycles of colonialism, of the cyclical reinvention and restructuring of global racism, global sexism, so that we have a system today that is the geohistorical crisis, the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid. Those have actually existing cyclical and cumulative histories. That is not the history of everything. I think that's your point. And indeed, we need regional stories, local stories, micro histories. and we need world histories. And those have to fit together. And one of the great weaknesses of uppercase E environmental thought has been its ridiculous ahistoricism. And so that's part of what this intervention does, is it confronts the Anthropocene. It says not only do we need to name the system, but we need to understand the epochal break in land-labor relations that occurs in the centuries following the Colombian invasion of 1492.
But this is not to say in any way that this was inevitable, right? Like, there is something about that cyclical nature, and maybe this is also that both of you are referring to, that is, at least for me, also troubling, right? In the sense that there is and that is what the question before was trying to get at, right? Like, the logic of capitalism and the logic of imperialism and colonialism kind of also invents its own history and its own way of thinking about how is that we move.
Well, the key world historian of this is Giovanni Arrighi, whose basic position was capitalism has to reinvent itself successively. So that was an anti-teleological point. But clearly there are cycles of proletarianization, of financialization, of imperial power and colonialism. Actually, these are not just sort of, conjured up out of the ethos. Otherwise, we shouldn't talk about capitalism at all.
No, absolutely, right. But they are contingent, right? And they're contingent to those specific. Yeah, they're
indeed. The points are, as we show in Seven Cheap Things, bitterly contested at every moment. So the turning point of the 19th century Industrial Revolution is also the moment of the Haitian, French, and American revolutions, of Pugachat's revolt, of Tupac Amaru and the Irish revolt. So yes, of course they were contested.
But there's also something to be said, and this is probably trying to bring us more into the present, right? Like, capitalism is the kind of long trajectory seems as stable, but obviously changes, right? And I wanted to talk a little bit more, and I know several of you have been working on this. If you can say a little bit more about what has changed during the past 30, 40 years in terms with the emergence of neoliberalism, technoscience as we know it today, because there are different worlds and different relationalities that change. And again, speaking specifically about how capitalism also depends on those worlds that depends and influences those worlds. So.
I want to answer that, and then I want to say something back
absolutely.
to what James was saying. Jason was saying. So one thing that I've in terms of what's changed is something that I've been thinking a lot about is financialization. So, in looking at fossil fuel capitalism and looking at like this project I'm doing, which it looks at the oldest refinery in the world. And that refinery begins around 1870. It's still existing. So you can learn a lot by studying the history of this refinery, which is as old as Canada itself, right? And so it also tells us the story of Canadian settler colonialism. It tells us a lot. But the thing about what's happened in the last 30 years is a lot of fossil fuel refining, fossil fuel transport, and fossil fuel extraction only makes financial sense, not in a direct profit out of the material activities of extraction and refining, but out of the financialization that is on top of those activities. And that is so you can fund pipelines that make no practical financial sense out of the rate of return on its financialization, which include a world of financial losses. And so one thing that I've become very interested in is when we think about hedge funds. I think we were talking about this a couple of months ago, that hedge funds and how they work is they need a world that is volatile in order to make a profit. They don't care. Hedge funds, the equations that make hedge funds aren't like a logical risk calculus deciding where to invest. Hedge funds work in a volatile world of things not working and failing as well as things doing well, right? And so in that version of financialization, capital does not care for its material form to succeed. It only cares about its financialized virtual form. Well, on the one hand, that's kind of scary in a certain way, maybe from the perspective of capital. But to me, I'm like, excellent. Here's a form of financial capital that doesn't care if the pipeline is built or not, because it's going to make money anyways, because it's going to bet against itself, right? It's going to short sell itself. So I can work with that, right? If that financialized capital is invested in perpetuating examples of material projects on the ground that do not work and fall apart and don't get built, I feel like, okay, well, first of all, that creates a whole space of fragility. And like that's something we can, I think, strategically and tactically exacerbate. A world in which extraction ends up not being built because financial capital doesn't care. That's true. And I can talk more about that.
Run by finance capital.
But I'm, and so in the case of, let's say, the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada, when finance capital decided, okay, well, we're not going to build the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the state came in, they bought it, but then they quickly were like, well, this is a crappy asset, and they're trying to sell it again. I could have a whole other conversation about the settler state and how I might be excited at its failure as well. But yeah, so there's something about that we could say what's happened in the last 30 years of capital that maybe introduces other tactics, and it directly influences the work that I do in terms of thinking about how to do work that messes with finances, capital, interest in the place where you are, right? So it might pull out and let then self-determination by that community determine what's happening there. And that's, it's not a planetary tactic, but it's a survival tactic for that particular place and world.
It's also a world historical tactic because of all of what you just described. Not to the exclusion. I think the danger, because we're dealing with a history in which radicals haven't dealt with this problem very well, is a danger of getting into either or, but we're not. There's a way to do both and, in which the stories are woven together. And sometimes we can do, as you say, we don't want to let them into our imaginary, okay, but they're in there anyway. Yes. But we don't want to let them in there. Yeah. And so how do we do a both and? And it's very tricky because of the way that the academy is set up, because of the way that these discourses are set up, the way, as Shona was saying, you get locked into certain positions.
And I guess where I would differ in terms of like laying out the problem space, I don't see the problem space as like needing to have big macro, like world, like system level, very large system level explanations, and then like complemented by micro explanations, which is one of the ways you talked about it, like local explanations or local accounts and local histories and micro histories that then complement the larger systemic.
That is not how I would.
Okay, well, maybe then I misunderstood, but that we want both of those things is what I heard.
Well, anytime we study a place, right, we study its connections with other kinds of places. Sometimes they're bigger, like Canada is a place in the account that you just gave, right? So capitalism is a place too. It's not just a system floating out there in the ether. It's neither more necessarily nor less necessarily important than a regional story. Otherwise, you get locked into regional particularism and system determinism. So how do we get out of that and weave the stories together?
And so I think, so then a difference, I think, in like, just like, what are the concepts we use to think these problems through, right? So a difference would be that it's less about thinking about capitalism's a place and regional stories are also a place and micro stories are also a place, like these kinds of things. I think that there's a temptation in that way of thinking where it's still like there's one world. And so there's this, so there, capitalism's a place and there's other places and they all make up kind of one world. And that's really different from thinking there's many worlds here. So for example, Anishinaabe creation story goes back to the Ice Age. It goes forward far into the future, and it includes the entire planet. It's not a local world. And so this question, like the question of there are many worldings here, is not like a scale question, I guess. The other worlds can also be very, very extensive in their time, in their understanding of the planet and the globe, of the celestial. They might get even really big into the cosmic, So it's not a kind of big, small, or regional, big kind of thing. That's why I like thinking more about like a pluriverse thinking rather than a systems thinking. But that's what I'm just saying.
But
What
I
are the
endorse
concepts
that,
you
but
use?
none of those positions are mine. I'm not a systems thinker,
Mm.
and I'm not big and small. In fact, the whole premise of web of life and world ecology is to blow up macro and micro, the very terms that you've used. So yes, indeed, we need many stories. And I feel like every time we come back to this, it's like, yes, but Jason, we don't want to have a global story, but the indigenous global stories are okay. Well, yes, they can both coexist. Dialectically speaking, they can coexist at the same time.
They can coexist,
And we
but
can
not.
tell different stories.
Yeah.
So I have an answer to this question. I'm not a historian. You all are historians. I'm out of the game. But I am interested in something that Michelle said, and I wonder if we could talk about it, or you all could talk about it. But I'm interested in the idea of failure and capitalism's sort of failures, right? The stuff that doesn't work. The thing that that sort of brings this home for me was credit default swaps and the idea that you could literally bet on failure and it would pay. But the way that Michelle talks about failure is that failure is possibility, right? The pipeline not getting built unless the state does do something weird and whatnot. So I wonder if you all could sort of say more about the potential way in which failure. When I think of, for instance, the Necrocene argument and the economics, I'm going to mess this guy's name up. It's like Warren Montag or Montag backwards. Failure is catastrophic, right? It's destructive, but I'm seeing a different sort of approach to failure here, and I want capitalism's failures are precisely the spaces, you know. Alternative ways of being actually develop something.
Well, there is a question of alternative ways of being. We've talked a lot about indigenous politics, but there's a different kind of politics we've had across the long 20th century. It has to do with a reality that climate crisis fused with the kind of authoritarian tendencies we've seen in the world today will produce, which is vast devastation around the world. So there is a question of forging a new and better life around state socialist projects. And we're supposed to all say, oh, those were always just as bad as everything the capitalists did. And I'm not sure that that's fair. I mean, state socialist projects were the projects of people in poor countries, often devastated, completely devastated by imperialist war, to build something better. And in an era of climate crisis, in an era when we are going to have not just a reparation ecology, but a reconstruction ecology, we are going to have to be, to borrow a phrase from Mao's trying to both read and expert. How does one rebuild all the cities on coastlines on this planet to the extent that they will be rebuilt in a way that is just, is democratic, and is functional? And so I think that's something that we should not take lightly. So maybe one of the ways that the Capitalocene argument helps to guide a certain kind of storytelling, and it's not all, there are many useful, maybe much more useful forms of storytelling besides Capitalocene. I would fully endorse that, especially about the utopistics and the imaginaries, and how do we move beyond and into new worlds with different cosmologies, which I endorse 1,000 times, but also how do we deal with the problem of a reconstruction ecology that doesn't give to the Anthropocene's geomanagerialism and anti-politics.
I still want to talk about failure, but I want to ask a different question right now.
Well, in this room. Right, this is our conversation, right?
Yeah. I wonder about.
Would you like it to be? We can hypothesize about that. But I mean, if we are concerned about justice and sustainability, then us in this room.
Yeah.
Question of the we, right? Like it always comes. So I think this is a good moment also while we think about the we, to open it up for the questions from the public. And again, for those of you watching online, please questions via the chat box on YouTube. So.
Well, we're waiting. Can we get
Yeah,
Jason
the microphones are.
I would love to hear you talk about failure, how you're thinking about failure.
Well, I think we're in the present state of the world because of capitalism's success.
Mm-hmm.
So the failures, yes, to cash in on crises, some capitalists always benefit. But crises generally are not good for capital. It requires the state to come in and reestablish conditions of accumulation. But I would say that the state of the world is because of capitalism's success. In that sense, Joseph Schumpeter was right. Can capitalism survive success? And his answer, Schumpeter was a very famous and very conservative economist, was no, it can't.
Questions from the audience?
Thanks so much. The conversation was really interesting. Something that struck me as explicit mention of climate change didn't really come up until sort of the very end. It's sort of been lurking under a lot of this, but I'm curious about how we think about climate change when we're trying to resist universalism, perhaps, as Michelle, you've been talking about. I can see it relating world making and resisting universalism in context and particularities and multiple worlds in thinking about maybe like adaptation to climate change. But I have a harder time resisting that universalism when thinking about mitigation, let's say. And so I'm curious, I guess, Michelle in particular, but any of you, how you think about climate change in trying to resist some of the totalizing and universalizing parts of the scenes.
Okay, so I guess the first place where I'd start is, of course, don't want to, there's so much work to deny climate change that it then becomes hard to talk critically about the ways we talk about climate change. So I want to just begin by saying that. And, I get fearful to feed climate denial, to talk critically about climate change. So what I want to say is yes, climate change, but there's something about the narrowness of the understanding of climate change that does not sit well with me. And that is, so often climate change is posited as a future-oriented problem, a problem that might be imminent, but still is yet to come, and denies a longer history that I think, Jason, you pointed out, I think that Shona's work is about, that goes back for centuries, that is about world breaking, plant destroying, animal killing, just that's much longer than climate change. So the question of for whom is the version of environmental violence that is climate change feels like it's something yet to come, versus for all the people who have been living with and in the condition of violence on land and bodies for a long time. So there's something about that timescape that I want to, be careful to be thinking about. And then the other thing about climate change is that, again, about thinking about its thinness. We can think about temperature rise, we can think about sea level rise. And this is one of the ways in which, if I'm going to say something good about the Anthropocene, right, is that it put a lot of kinds of violences on the table at once, right? which climate change tries to, I think, thins a problem that is much thicker, right? And so, so I think about for whom does a thinner version of a livable world as climate change become the white framing of the problem, right? Maybe you might be a person for whom the most pressing danger is the state, depending where you live, right? Maybe you might be living in a world where the most pressing danger is a violent extractive mining company. Maybe you're, so this is kind of why I tend to I want to be careful because of course, climate change, I wouldn't deny its materiality, but I think it's and this maybe just reflects a lot of our concepts, like our conversation, which is how do we choose between concepts for talking about things, right? And what do different concepts do and don't do as we're trying to, talk about really thick, multi-scaled, complex, multi-worlded problems. It gets tricky. So for me, I tend not to go first to climate change. I talk often environmental violence. So environmental violence includes for me things like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It includes the police as a hostile force for some people, for some communities. These I think are just as important. It includes the military, right? And so when I talk to students about climate justice, I often say they feel so depressed about it and what can we possibly do, But there's a strange thing, which is when we understand this thicker sense of environmental violence, then what to do is much clearer. What to do is whatever thing you're already doing, whatever justice project you are doing to sustain your community and its life supports, that is the climate justice project that you need to be doing. And so there's something strange about, so anyways, those are some of my reflections about why I don't go to climate justice, but I also just want to be careful to say, I'm not denying climate change.
The longer histories of that violences, right, that are related to something that all of a sudden we are preoccupied about, right? When there has been a planetary crisis for a lot of people.
Exactly, for a long time. And so that timescape, yeah, but maybe you have.
And I feel like it becomes important because it's beginning, because whatever climate changes, it's affecting certain bodies. So maybe Al Gore is concerned about how it affects his bodies. But when you, enslave people and force them to eat salted meat for how many hundreds of years, that's climate change. And it seemed not to have mattered to people until, again, it began to affect other populations. So again, it's hard because we need to wake up, we need to pay attention, and I don't want to undo the work that the term is doing, although the term is, again, an opposition to global warming because people couldn't handle the term global warming. So the term is also already doing a limited kind of work. But I am disturbed by the fact that it's only an issue because of how it affects certain populations, how those populations want to look at it. And it also reinforces what I think Jason has been working against, and that is, again, the sort of nature-society divide.
Humans that did it. It's anthropogenic, don't you know? And then if we argue against it, then we have all the anxieties of how you stated it perfectly and elegantly.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. And I feel like I'm a bit of a newcomer to some of these debates, and so some of my questions might be a little basic. But I wanted to just ask for a couple of clarifications. First, sort of address to, I'm trying to get into the kind of debate between, I guess, Michelle Murphy and Jason Moore. And so for Michelle Murphy, I think that the question that I had was, when on the one hand, you seem to be in agreement with Jason Moore to some extent, to the say, well, I also want to analyze capitalism and so on. But then you don't want capitalism to colonize the imagination. And so then the immediate question that I have is how one really relates imagination to analysis. Because it's almost like we can say, okay, there's capitalism, it's this, I guess the question is how we're going to understand capital, but then I can just recede into an imagination and then sort of create something different, another world or whatever. And I think the problem is going to be, well, how do we link, how is capitalism mediating that imagination in some way, and how does one deal with that, I think is the first question. And then I think that the next part is related to this, because there was also a part that says, I am my own foundation. And I'm wondering about the politics of that foundation. I mean, because there's a sense in which that to me sounds a lot, it almost makes me think of Kant, right? Because there's this almost an autonomy, the argument. But I think one of the issues here is precisely that in a capitalist world, I mean, heteronomy is prevalent. Is autonomy even possible? Is it possible for us to be our foundation? And this is where land, the link between land and so on. And I think then finally, I think this is addressed to Jason Moore, is there was a sense, there were a couple of times when you kept talking about capitalism being a place, right? And I think that what I would like to sort of add as a footnote to that is that there's also the temporality of capitalism, that if capitalism is just a place, it doesn't quite get to the dynamic, which is precisely what undercuts projects of autonomy and justice. And I guess the one final footnote is with justice is, at the beginning, there was a lot of discussion about the problem of world historical and universality. And it almost seemed like world historical is okay, but universality isn't. And I'm wondering how we understand terms like justice if there's no universality. Is this going to be a particularized justice? And it's some of it is just not clear to me.
Okay, I'm not sure I can address everything,
Can address.
but I'll maybe have adjust a little bit of it. So when I say that I don't want to cede imagination to capital and capitalism, I actually believe in an asubjective theory of imagination, which is I'm not just talking about my impersonal imagination, but I'm talking about the kind of conditions of possibility of dreaming, of striving, of feeling together, that are conditioned by our infrastructures, they're conditioned by the practices, et cetera. So I don't think, I believe like machines also constitute conditions of dreaming. I believe that economic planning attempts to constitute the conditions of our dreaming. And when I say that, I mean, it's like what we hope for, what we strive for, to have hope itself, to have our fantasies, I would say kind of colonized or occupied by the terms of capital. Like, I'm not willing to cede that. And part of it is because I think capitalism is so wanting to offer itself as a sublime, offer itself as something that's like fully surrounding us, offer itself up as something that like all our hopes are necessarily in conversion to. And I just want to resist that version of understanding like the elsewhere that's existing with capitalism. I think feeling and affect, imaginaries, dreams are all really powerful political parts of our worldings. And so they're not kind of just like the add-on to analysis or something like that. They're kind of maybe another kind of struggle about like, what is it possible to dream for ourselves and with each other and under what conditions and what's the conditions of our dreaming. So that's one kind of thought. Then I'm not sure I remember all the other parts to the question.
Might be.
But Jason might
What
remember.
you want to address that, and
Oh,
then
maybe
you can.
something about the universal. How can we have justice without the universal? Was maybe a
Yeah, the
question.
idea. Yeah.
I don't need a frame of justice that's for everyone. Like that's the liberal project, in a way, is to have like imagine you can make a universal justice that's for everyone, that's inclusive of all. And we know as soon as that happens, then we have like, well, who's not included, what gets left out, the kind of imperial stretch of it. The question of like, what is justice is a really important one. It's one I think that also like indigenous scholars are struggling with, because our theories of justice also often presume something like law or something like the nation state as like part of where justice might be found. And I'm really interested in thinking about what are kinds of justice that reject the nation state. What are kinds of justice that can be constituted at a scale with each other in communities, that governance can happen at much smaller scales. Justice can happen at much smaller scales. And maybe it's not the justice that we're used to thinking of, which is like, how do we get like ExxonMobil to pay reparations? But it is the justice of feeling like, how do we live with ethical relationality like here, right now? And that to me is the version of justice that I find most actionable. The other kinds of justice, I feel like I'm calling down the settler state on me. I have the temptation of, giving an imperial ethical system to all of humanity, and I wouldn't want to do any of those things. So I'm interested in much more, I would say, like more humble version of justice.
Well, justice, not universal, but world historical. I would endorse everything that Michelle said and add an and. We don't need to be at loggerheads around this. I think all of what you said is indispensable, is crucial. And I think that for me, I don't know how to think through justice. I don't know who does know how to think through justice because of the traditions of Western universalism, of liberalism, of many other experiences. The history of 20th century socialist, labor, communist, anti-colonial movements basically teaches us this, that drawing lines around who gets liberation, who gets emancipated, and who gets justice and who does not is an utter failure, is totally ineffective. So how do we move forward and beyond an anthropocentric conception of justice to a multi-species conception of justice? How does it deal with the planetary? I think, Michelle, what your comments raise is an enormously vexing problem that I don't have the answer to, which is capital at this moment in its death throes, and that doesn't mean something better comes next, but in its death throes is laying waste to planetary life. So the future of life on this planet, and I don't mean this in a we're all going to die kind of sense, maybe we will, or we all will eventually, right? But the future of planetary life turns on the kinds of projects of international solidarity, the confrontation of empires, of authoritarianisms, of transnational corporations at every scale, at every place across the mosaic of planetary life. I think that it is a world in which the planetary and world historical are unavoidable. We can choose to ignore it or not. I don't think you're saying we should choose to ignore it at all. I want to be clear that we need a both and approach here, but it will trouble us at our core, our politics, our imagination, about how do we move forward? How do we have a multi-species, radical, participatory, and reconstructive ecology of justice is one of the great questions that we are only now beginning to open up. This conversation is very exciting because it's opening up these questions. How do we think this?
Just to follow up on that and just something that Michelle said, when we think about justice, like what justice does the settler state provide, right? On the settler state's terms, and that's the opposition between. You see that sort of play out in the opposition between civil rights civil rights and indigenous sovereignty. So that there's always going to be a problem there. There's always going to be relational, ethical ways in which we can that you suggest, I think, are necessary. The other thing is to answer the question had to do with about imagination and the imagination and analysis. And I think that you actually do that sort of wonderfully in your work, the economization of life, which I was reading on my 3-hour drive to Dallas today to catch a plane. But you talk about Pearl, and so you could tell people who that is, but you talk about Pearl. And one of the things that is so striking about that book and how you begin the book is the way that you actually denaturalize what we think of as economy, right? So the economy is just this thing, it exists, right? It's just a word, but you actually provincialize and contextualize it. And I think that's what imagination does. That's the place from trying to, but to get to someplace else, to get to something else, to not be held captive by the terms or the systems that we have in front of us, but to actually denaturalize them. And that's what you do with economy by thinking through what Pearl does. So, yeah.
Partially because justice and history are also so closely linked, right? And imagination allows us to push outside those boundaries, right? It's a very contemporary.
Hello. My question is for Shona, but all three of you can answer it, obviously. I study community and environmental sociology and economics, and it's something that's a really interesting pairing because I feel like something that I hear a lot in environmentalism, and especially environmental socialism, is this idea that capitalism has created this awful problem for us. The system is broken and cyclical and repeating, and the only real way for a solution to come to that system is for something to break free of it, to have a subversive response, to have a counter movement. And something that I struggle with the idea that capitalists can't solve their own problem is that it shifts the responsibility of their problem onto other people. The idea that if a capitalist can't solve the capitalist problem within the capitalist system, then someone outside of it, like you're kind of looking around for the grassroots movement to pop up and solve all the problems. Like it's, in my opinion, it kind of troubles me in that it shifts the responsibility towards these counter movements, towards these subversions that are existing and are strong. But I think it places a lot of responsibility in saying, okay, the capitalists ruined it and now someone else needs to come and fix it. So kind of how does that responsibility come in with different populations that have experienced capitalism differently, whether or not a capitalist can do anything helpful, and how responsibility is moved among different populations.
So I'm not sure I can answer that, but that connects with what I was asking before about the we, and also trying to think about complicity. So capitalism is sort of brilliant because it works in sort of, you can think of it in a macro way, but you can again also think about it in, I just bought this. Luckily, it was not from a Starbucks, but I just bought this, right? And so there was just the proposal for the Green New Deal that had its own issues and it got shot down. But our senators, they're not going to solve the problem for us, right? They're not going to solve the problem for us. I don't think that we have to rely on others. And I think what Michelle is kind of suggesting is that us as individuals, right? That we individually have to act in some way. I think that what we have to do is actually question how we are told to act. So we are told to recycle, but then our recycling goes to China, right? Or it goes in a landfill next to a community. And so I think one, we have to act, but two, we actually have to, again, question the parameters in which we think that we can mobilize and act and work. And I'm not very good at that. I have a 6 and a 7-year-old, and I'm honestly just trying to survive them. So yeah, if you have better ideas.
Well, I could talk a little bit about like my kind of go-to theory of change, which is that I don't see my task as trying to like fix capitalism, but what I'm interested in maybe is more is figuring out how to refuse certain aspects of capitalism or colonialism or white supremacy, to refuse them, and in doing so, to then try to free up room for the something else. And that something else isn't an individual thing, because you can only do the something else like with others, but the scale of it isn't the nation state, right? The scale of it is often much more humble in terms of the scale of which we can make that something else, because of all the complicities, because we are under the incredible violence of settler colonialism, because racial capitalism might be so hostile in our life. But what we can achieve are these almost like bubble zones of something else. And that's, that's a different theory of politics. Now, one can say you're never going to stop climate change and global capital with that theory of political change. But I also feel like I'm basically super pessimistic. So this is like the theory of change that I feel like has like the chance at doing something else. I think it's a theory of change where it has a chance of not waiting for a better condition, a better moment, waiting for it's something you can do when things are impossible. Right? It's a theory of change that like we can do like right now together. And so in terms of thinking about like that responsibility, it's not that I feel like I have to fix capitalism, or I have to fix, but I do feel like I have to refuse and just say no strategically to particular things. And with others, let's refuse this. Let's stop this. The stopping is that's like so much more doable. And then it's like a little space, okay, there's something else. Now you have to start to try to figure out, and you don't have to know what the something else is to do the stopping, right? Sometimes it's like, I'm not going to say this word anymore. I'm not going to use this argument anymore. I'm not going to do this practice anymore. I'm not going to appeal to the settler state anymore, whatever it might be. And then in terms of the something else, and maybe this goes to one of the unanswered parts of the question in terms of I am my own foundation. In terms of understanding Indigenous sovereignty, there's one way of understanding Indigenous sovereignty as being in some kind of like analog to nation state sovereignty. It's like there's like a governance, and then it has to make its claim on sovereignty, and it has to be like recognized by others. And there's another way of thinking about sovereignty, which is like sovereignty is imminent. It is just there. It is, it just already is. And it doesn't need you to acknowledge it in order to be. And so, okay, so if you think of that, then it's also the case that when you say no and you do something else, there's also, it's not that you have to like just make up things. There is a sovereignty and a self-determination in the relation to land that just is, that is already there for you to connect to. And so this is also part of the theory of change. But I kind of hear what you're saying, and I kind of think it reminds me of like the way we talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And and when I talk about Chemical Valley, like whose job is it to like shut down Chemical Valley? Is it the job of Aamjadang First Nation, who's like most affected, or is it the job of like settler Canadians to say Chemical Valley and Canada as a petrochemical state shouldn't stand? So I understand that kind of argument, and so I kind of maybe see like maybe that's what you're thinking of, but that's different kind of argument than the argument that's saying capitalism should solve its own problems, because capitalism's only going to reproduce itself. It's not going to refuse itself. So they aren't parallel to my thinking. I don't know if that connects to what you are thinking about.
Michael, thank you so much for a great panel. And I think that Jason and Michelle, your differences are irreconcilable, period.
No,
I
say
don't
it
care what you
itself.
say. Here's what I will try to reconcile it. So, I mean, I think in part the difference, I mean, you actually are meeting on one point, and that's what is producing the irreconcilability. And that point is that you're thinking of capitalism as a really well-founded, finished product that started probably in the 1700s, and it's still with us now in the same form, the same way, no history. I'll tell you why. And I mean, that's exactly the question. So is it that? And if it is so, I mean, my point is that capitalism, why would capitalism not be an imagination, right? It's part of the community production. So in my sense, capitalism comes out, or even the proximate capitalism, because you never really are finished. There is no finished product that is capitalism, but it comes out of these connections, these interactions within communities themselves, and they produce it in interaction with other communities. European settler colonialism comes out. They touch into systems of governance that are different. The relationship between capitalism and local communities is not one of implication, right? It's not that there is a top-down kind of enforcement of a system of capital, but there is a very genuinely organic kind of relations that are very much at the local level that interact with that system, with that settler colonial system, right? And it produces what we can call maybe at some point capitalism. And because of that, capitalism is not a well-founded system that we know all the iterations of, but it is emerging, and it's always emerging. And it's emerging precisely because of the imaginations that communities have, right? Or against some imaginations, because communities are not united or unified. But there are struggles, right? And so in one way, one can acknowledge the fact that capitalism itself is a process of imagining, but at the same time, that it is also present, and it has force, and it has the way that articulations happen between and within communities are really important, right? There are, there is force, there is genocide, but there is also collaboration. There is, a number of things. So it's an emerging kind of system, or I don't really want to call it a system, but it's an emerging relation of the economy and population and land, but it's an emerging one. And it comes out of these iterations, local iterations. I don't know, please.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think of that? Is
capitalism an emergent phenomena? Yes. Does it restructure itself periodically over the course of the past 5 centuries? Not the 1700s.
No, but that's fine.
From 1492 and this long 16th century. But yes, of course, we have to take seriously dialectics, which is about becoming and becoming with. So we have to have a sympoetic sensibility about this.
Right.
He said to keep it short.
I was gonna, can I just say one, thought, which is like, I think in universities, we're often taught, or in the humanities, like the way we're taught to tell stories, like we're supposed to figure out how to like smooth over the things that are irresolvable, or smooth over the incommensurability, right? We want to like patch it up, we want to like resolve it, and that's like the sign of like agreement or getting along, as opposed to thinking that like the world is constituted via incommensurabilities. Like the fact that we have incommensurabilities in this room is like really useful, and we have to like be comfortable, in surfacing, talking about, being in these incommensurabilities. So I kind of felt that tonight, and I kind of felt that as a very generative thing.
Thank you.